The winter of 1934 was not just a season in New York City, it was a political storm that threatened to freeze the very blood of the underworld. The wind howling off the Hudson River carried the sharp scent of wet iron and the desperate hopes of millions struggling through the Great Depression. Down at the Manhattan piers, a crowd had gathered, but they weren't there for work. They were there for a spectacle of destruction. Standing at the edge of the dock was Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, a man known as the Little Flower, but on this day, he looked like a god of thunder. In his hands was a massive, heavy sledgehammer. Before him sat a line of gleaming, chrome-plated slot machines. The one-armed bandits that served as the golden geese of Frank Costello's empire. These machines were everywhere, in barber shops, candy stores, and speakeasies, turning every nickel in New York into a drop of gold for the man they called the Prime Minister. LaGuardia turned to the cameras, his face flushed with righteous fury. "This is the cancer of our society," he roared. "We are going to tear Frank Costello's fingers out of the pockets of this city once and for all." He raised the hammer high above his head, the metal glinting in the pale winter sun, and with a grunt of pure hatred, he brought it down. The sound of wood splintering and metal shrieking echoed across the water. Thousands of nickels began to pour out, not onto the floor, but directly into the dark, murky depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The crowd cheered as the mayor systematically annihilated millions of dollars in future revenue, convinced he was watching the end of a king, but just blocks away, in a penthouse suite at the Waldorf Astoria, a man was watching the same scene through a pair of expensive binoculars. Frank Costello stood as still as a statue, his silk robe catching the light, a thick Cuban cigar smoldering in his hand. His associates were pacing the room, sweating, their voices cracking with panic as they watched their fortune sink to the bottom of the harbor. "Frank, we have to move. They're destroying everything," one of them shouted. Costello didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. He simply watched the sledgehammer fall again, and then, he did something that chilled everyone in the room to the bone. He smiled. It was a slow, knowing smile that suggested he wasn't watching a tragedy, he was watching a liberation. "Before we reveal the terrifyingly brilliant words Frank Costello whispered to his associates in that moment, and how he turned this public execution into the greatest financial victory in Mafia history, you need to understand something about the nature of the game. Most men play to win the day, Frank Costello played to own the century. If you are the kind of person who understands that a strategic retreat is often the fastest way to a total conquest, then you are exactly where you belong. This channel is a sanctuary for the thinkers, the strategists, and those who know that real power is never found in a sledgehammer, but in the mind that predicts where it will fall. If you're ready to master the art of the invisible move, hit that subscribe button right now. Give this video a like to signal your respect for the long game. And I want you to go down to the comments and type the word strategy in all caps. Let's see who among you has the vision to see past the noise. Now, let's return to that penthouse, where the Prime Minister was about to prove that he was 5 steps ahead of the law. Costello finally turned away from the window, the smoke from his cigar curling around his head like a crown of grey silk. "Let him smash them," Costello said, his voice a raspy, calm melody. "In fact, send him a telegram and thank him. The mayor is doing our dirty work for us." His associate stared at him as if he had lost his mind. But Costello wasn't crazy, he was a mathematician of human nature. He had already calculated that New York was becoming too expensive. The rungs of the ladder were becoming slippery with too many bribes, too much federal heat, and a public that was growing tired of the noise. The slot machines were high-maintenance assets in a city that was currently on fire. By allowing LaGuardia to destroy the machines in such a public, theatrical way, Costello was achieving 3 things that no amount of money could buy. First, he was giving the mayor a victory. A politician who thinks he has already won is a politician who stops looking for you. Second, he was cleaning his books. Those machines were old, they were registered in ways that could be traced, and they were a legal liability. LaGuardia was literally sinking Costello's evidence into the ocean. And third, Costello was preparing for a migration that would make the New York nickels look like pocket change. He sat down at his mahogany desk and pulled out a map of the United States. His finger didn't land on Chicago or Miami. It landed on Louisiana. There, a man named Huey Long, the Kingfish, ruled the state with an iron grip and a silver tongue. Long was a populist who wanted to build roads, schools, and hospitals, but he lacked the liquid capital to bypass the traditional banks and political enemies who wanted to see him fail. Costello saw the perfect opportunity, a partnership between a king and a prime minister. New York is a graveyard for these machines now, Costello explained to his inner circle. But in Louisiana, the law doesn't just look the other way, the law becomes our partner. He had already orchestrated a secret meeting with Long. The deal was simple and devastatingly effective. Costello would move his entire operation to Louisiana. He would provide the machines, the logistics, and the entertainment. In return, Huey Long would provide state-sanctioned protection. The rife wouldn't be paid to a street cop on a corner, it would be paid into charitable funds that Long used to build his political dynasty. It was the first time the American underworld had successfully integrated itself into the very infrastructure of a state government. As the crates began to ship out of New York under the cover of darkness, Costello was already looking at the blueprints for a new kind of machine. These wouldn't be the clunky wood and iron boxes LaGuardia was smashing. These were state-of-the-art, designed to be more addictive and more profitable. While the headlines in the New York Times were screaming about the end of the slots, Costello was already counting the millions that hadn't even been made yet. He was moving from a world of crime into a world of monopoly. He knew that the public image of him as a defeated man was his greatest shield. He maintained his quiet, dignified presence in New York, appearing at the finest restaurants, tipping the waiters generously, and never speaking a word of the machines. He let the mayor take the bows. He let the press write the obituaries for his gambling empire. He understood the most important rule of power: the man who is feared is often targeted, but the man who is underestimated is free. The transition was surgical. Within months, the Louisiana Mint was born. The machines were no longer tucked away in the back of dusty speakeasies. They were in the most prominent locations in New Orleans, from the high-end hotels of the French Quarter to the busy drugstores of the suburbs. And because a portion of the proceeds went to the charity, the public didn't see them as a vice, they saw them as a contribution to the state's growth. Costello had managed to do the impossible. He had made the one-armed bandit a respectable citizen, but as the money began to flow in, faster and heavier than even Costello had predicted, a new problem began to emerge. The sheer scale of the wealth was attracting the attention of people much more dangerous than Mayor LaGuardia. The other four families in New York were watching. They saw the Prime Minister's defeat and were starting to wonder if he was getting soft. They didn't see the Louisiana gold mine yet, they only saw a man who had let his machines be dumped into the sea without a fight. In the world of the Mafia, perceived weakness is a death sentence. Vito Genovese, a man whose soul was as dark as the pits of hell, began to whisper in the ears of the other bosses. "Frank is finished," he would say over glasses of red wine in dark social clubs. "He lets a little man with a hammer take his pride. A man without pride cannot lead the commission." The tension was building. Costello knew he had to do more than just make money. He had to prove that his "thank you to the mayor" wasn't a sign of submission, but a declaration of war on a level they couldn't even comprehend. He called for a meeting of the commission. Not to apologize, not to explain, but to show them the future. He walked into that room with the same calm grace he had shown in the penthouse. He didn't bring bodyguards. He didn't bring a gun. He brought a single ledger. When he opened it and showed the bosses the numbers from the first 3 months in Louisiana, the room went silent. The profit from 1 month in New Orleans was triple what they had made in a year in Manhattan. Costello looked at Genovese, his eyes cold and sharp. "The mayor destroyed my past." Costello whispered. "I used him to build our future. Does anyone else have a problem with my weakness?" The silence in the commission room was heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket of shock and sudden realization. Vito Genovese's face, which usually carried a sneer of arrogant contempt, was now a mask of frustrated greed. The leather-bound ledger Costello had laid out on the mahogany table wasn't just a record of money, it was a map of a new world, written in the ink of genius and the blood of missed opportunities. While the other bosses were still fighting for blood-stained street corners in Brooklyn and humid docks in New Jersey, Costello had conquered an entire American state without firing a single bullet. He had turned a political crackdown into a corporate expansion, and in that moment, the title Prime Minister was no longer a nickname, it was a cold, hard reality. The expansion in Louisiana, known internally as Operation Pelican, became the blueprint for the modern Mafia. But to understand its success, you have to understand the journey. Costello didn't just ship machines, he shipped a philosophy. As the trucks rolled south, bypassing the FBI's watchful eyes by moving through a series of front logistics companies, Costello was transforming the underworld into an invisible industry. He understood that to keep the money flowing in the Deep South, he had to make himself indispensable to the people who held the keys to the kingdom. He wasn't just looking for a hideout. He was looking for a partner in the most powerful man in the South, Huey the Kingfish Long. Long was a force of nature. He was a man who promised to make every man a king, but to fuel his populist fire, he needed a furnace that burned cash 24 hours a day. When Costello sat down with Long in the humid, cigar-scented backrooms of New Orleans, he didn't talk about crime. He talked about infrastructure. He told Long, "Governor, you want to build roads that the people will love you for. I want to place machines in the bars at the end of those roads. You provide the protection, and I will provide the prosperity." It was the ultimate pact. The Kingfish provided the political lightning, and the Prime Minister provided the financial ground. Costello's true brilliance, however, lay in the Pelican State Charity Group. This wasn't just a shell company, it was a stroke of psychological warfare. He understood that the people of Louisiana were deeply religious and deeply skeptical of New York outsiders. So, he made the slot machines respectable. He made them charitable. He ensured that a visible percentage of every nickel went directly into funds that built local orphanages, supported struggling parishes, and funded the very hospitals that Huey Long was promising the poor. Suddenly, the one-armed bandit wasn't a vice, it was a contribution. A man losing his weekly wages in a bar could walk home telling himself he was helping build a school. This created a layer of social armor that no federal agent could pierce. When a local sheriff thought about raiding a Costello machine, he had to ask himself, do I want to be the man who takes money away from the local children's hospital? The answer was always no. Costello had successfully weaponized the moral compass of the South to protect his gambling empire. The financial explosion that followed was something the Mafia had never witnessed. In New York, the bureaucracy of crime was bloated. You had to pay the beat cop, the sergeant, the precinct captain, the local judge, and the district leader. By the time the money reached the boss, 60% of it had been taxed by the system. But in Louisiana, Costello had centralized the corruption. He didn't pay 1,000 men, he paid the system itself. He had a direct line to the governor's mansion and the state police. His overhead costs plummeted to near zero, while his profit margin soared into the stratosphere. The machines were everywhere. They were in the bustling hotels of the French Quarter, where jazz music filled the air and the elite sipped Sazeracs. They were in the quiet drugstores of Baton Rouge, where housewives would drop their change while waiting for prescriptions. They were in the rough-and-tumble barks of the bayou, where oil workers and fishermen sought a moment of luck. Every pull of a lever was a heartbeat in Costello's new financial body. By the end of the 1930s, the worthless machines that Mayor LaGuardia had smashed were replaced by a network that was generating the modern equivalent of over $100 million in pure, untraceable profit every single year. Back in New York, the psychological defeat of his enemies was complete. Mayor LaGuardia continued his theatrical crusade, occasionally smashing a stray machine for the cameras, oblivious to the fact that he was attacking a ghost. He was the hero of a story that was already over. Costello, meanwhile, maintained his quiet, dignified presence in Manhattan. He stayed in the best hotels, tipped the waiters with crisp $100 bills, and attended the opera. He never gloated. He never bragged. He let the mayor have the headlines, while he kept the gold. This was the core of Costello's power. He understood that the man who is underestimated is the man who is truly free, but the most dangerous threat wasn't the law, it was the envy of his own kind. In the social clubs of Little Italy, Vito Genovese was still whispering. He couldn't understand how Costello could let himself be humiliated by a mayor. To a man like Genovese, power was a fist. To Costello, power was a whisper. The tension culminated in the legendary commission meeting where Costello finally opened his ledgers. He didn't just show them the money, he showed them the safety of the money. He pointed out that while Genovese's men were being arrested for petty street crimes, Costello's operation was being protected by the very state that was supposed to prosecute them. Vito, Costello said, his voice a raspy melody of authority, you fight for the streets. I own the map. You want to be a boss? Then learn that a bullet only travels a few hundred yards. A handshake can travel 1,000 miles. The room went silent. Even Genovese couldn't argue with the math. Costello had turned the 5 families from a group of warring gangs into a national syndicate with legitimate political protection. He had taken the Mafia out of the gutter and placed it in the boardroom. The Louisiana gold mine became the war chest for the next great evolution of the American underworld, Las Vegas. The millions generated by those slot machines provided the seed money for the desert empire. When Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel looked toward the sands of Nevada, it was Costello's Louisiana profits that fueled the vision. He was the silent architect of the Neon City, the man who understood that if you could make gambling respectable in Louisiana, you could make it a national industry in the desert. Frank Costello survived the wars, the hits, the federal hearings, and the betrayals because he was the only man who knew when to let go of the past. He didn't cry over the 1,000 machines in the Hudson River. He didn't seek revenge against the mayor who tried to shame him. He simply thanked him for the opportunity to move on to something bigger. He died peacefully in 1973, in a hospital bed at the age of 82, having lived a life that was more like a statesman's than a gangster's. He was the only one of the original kings to die with his wealth, his freedom, and his reputation as the prime minister intact. The lesson of the slot machine war is a masterclass in strategic resilience. It teaches us that a crisis is never just a disaster, it is a filtering mechanism. It filters out the weak, the loud, and the stubborn, leaving only the flexible and the wise. When your enemy is smashing your assets, don't look at what you're losing. Look at what is clearing away to make room for your next move. Frank Costello whispered thank you because he knew that the mayor's sledgehammer was actually breaking the chains that kept him tied to a dying business model. In the end, power isn't about the size of your hammer. It's about the depth of your vision. Costello didn't just survive New York, he outgrew it. He didn't just lead the mob, he refined it. And as he sat on his veranda in his final years, looking out at the world he had helped shape, he knew that his greatest victory wasn't the $100 million. It was the fact that while everyone else was playing checkers, he had been the only one playing the long, silent game of chess. If you've stayed with us until this very moment, you are someone who appreciates the intricate beauty of a perfect strategy. You know that the world isn't run by the people making the most noise, but by the people making the most calculated moves. Frank Costello was the ultimate architect of the shadows, and his life is a blueprint for anyone who wants to master the art of the invisible win. Hit that subscribe button if you are ready to stop playing the short game and start building your own empire. Give this video a like to show that you value intelligence over brute force. And I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. If your business or your dream was being smashed in public today, would you have the courage to walk away and build something 10 times bigger in the shadows? Or would you stay and fight a losing battle? Let's talk about the Prime Minister's way. Stay sharp, stay patient, and always remember, when the world thinks you've lost, that's exactly when you've won. We'll see you in the next story.